I hate video game remakes, primarily because I find them inferior to the original in one area or another. And one of those areas I have issue with is art direction. The next one I have issue with is gameplay, and the third I have issue with is characterization. And we're going to go each one of them one by one and go into them in more detail, starting with art direction. And I'll use Shadow of the Colossus as an example here. So Shadow of the Colossus is a game where you, as the player, controls a silent protagonist named Wanderer, who is seen in the opening cutscenes of the game carrying his dead friend, a girl named Mono, to a forbidden land in hopes of bringing her back to life. And after placing her on the altar, he then hears a deep and mysterious voice that claims he can revive her, but only if Wanderer can defeat 16 giant colossi scattered across the land. Determined to bring his dead friend back to life, the protagonist sets out on a perilous journey to hunt the colossi down one by one. That's the setup of the game. Now, when this title came out, it was praised by both game journalists and video game fans. And I would agree with most of that praise, specifically the art direction in this, since in the original Shadow of the Colossus, the lighting and blur weren't just aesthetic limitations, they were doing emotional and thematic work. The shrine interiors, especially the opening ritual scene where you lay Mono down, are filled with soft bloom, heavy shadow, and unnatural glow sources that don't behave like real-world light. Torches, floor illumination, and ambient haze blend together in a way that doesn't feel like a ruined building. It feels like a threshold, a space that is already partly elsewhere. And these visual effects are important, because the story itself is literally about crossing into a forbidden realm and breaking natural law in order to revive someone. The visual language reinforces that idea. Since you're not in some grounded abandoned temple, you're in something liminal, almost dreamlike, where reality is unstable and symbolic. That's why I was disappointed when I found out that the PS4 remake of Shadow of the Colossus went in a vastly different art direction, trading that visual language of a dreamlike place for realism. Since the lighting system is far more physically accurate, since light sources are cleaner, shadows are sharper, and global illumination behaves like it would in a real stone structure. So in the opening altar scene, instead of that diffused eternal glow, you mostly get realistic lighting, where light comes in from outside, bouncing off stone, illuminating surfaces realistically. The result is something where it feels less like a forbidden land where one has the opportunity to cross from one realm to another to just another random abandoned temple, one I've honestly seen 100 times over. And this realism, unfortunately, is mostly consistent with the rest of the remake version of the game. For example, in the original, the mountains in the distance as you travel in the beginning of the game don't just sit on the horizon, they feel like a pulling force, almost like they're calling you forward. The sky, the bloom, and the soft blur make the entire world feel united, like a single living painting. Nothing looks geographically real in a grounded sense, but everything feels emotionally consistent. But in the remake, it just looks like some mountains you'd find in North America. Additionally, the forests you travel to feel very transformative. Instead of a little forest, it feels like a fairy tale rainforest that shouldn't quite exist. It's dense, it's luminous, and slightly abstract. However, now in the remake, it just feels like a literal forest that you could easily find somewhere in South America. It's just so disappointing, man. Especially since the art direction is one of the main selling points of the original game whenever I hear people talk about it. How the visuals tells a narrative despite there being not really much dialogue. And for them to screw up the art direction in the remake, it's just like, yeah, I'll stick with the original, man. Another reason I hate many modern video game remakes is because they completely change the gameplay instead of preserving what made the original games unique. A perfect example of this is when comparing the original Resident Evil 2 and 3 on the PS1 to its remakes Resident Evil 2 and 3 on the PS4. Now, in case you're absolutely new to gaming and aren't aware, the Resident Evil series became one of the most successful survival horror franchises of all time. And one of the reasons I personally like the original games is because of the specific design philosophy behind the original games. Since when people think of classic Resident Evil, they often think of fixed camera angles, tank controls, limited resources, and a constant feeling of vulnerability. These mechanics were not randomly put into the game, they were deliberate design choices that helped create the horror experience. And it's unfortunate that many modern players criticize the original game's tank controls because they feel it's either awkward or restrictive. For me, however, that limitation was part of the horror. Since in the original Resident Evil 2 and 3, your character does not move with the fluidity of a modern action game. Since doing basic things like turning around takes time, running past enemies is difficult, since you're often running past enemies in extremely linear and narrow spaces like hallways. So escaping danger requires careful planning rather than reflexes. Every encounter feels dangerous because the controls prevent you from reacting instantly. And I want you guys to imagine walking down a narrow hallway and suddenly hearing a zombie growl. In a modern game, you can quickly spin the camera, assess the situation, and run around the threat. However, in the original Resident Evil 2 and 3, your character must physically turn around before moving. Those few seconds create panic because you know the zombie is closing in on you while you're struggling to escape. The result is a game where the controls themselves become part of the tension. And I haven't even gotten into the fixed camera angles, which add even more horror. Since unlike modern games where the camera follows the player, the original Resident Evil 2 and 3 uses predetermined camera shots. This means you cannot see what lies around the next corner. As a result, the game constantly creates uncertainty and fear. For example, you might enter a room and only see part of the environment because of the camera angle. A zombie could be standing just outside your field of view. You hear footsteps or growling, but you cannot immediately identify the source. This creates suspense because your imagination begins filling in the gaps of encountering the thing, whatever the player finds the most terrifying. The fear comes from not knowing what is waiting for you. In many ways, this is similar to how many of my favorite horror films work, since the most effective horror often comes from what you cannot see rather than what you can. When the audience lacks information, it leads to their imagination becoming their worst enemy. The original Resident Evil games used the fixed camera system to achieve this same effect. By limiting what the player can see, the game creates a fear of the unknown. Additionally, the fixed camera angles also allow the developers to carefully frame scenes like a movie, and fans often point to moments where a creature is partially obscured by the environment or where a hallway is shown from a dramatic angle that builds suspense. Some players have even argued that the certain horror sequences lose their impact when viewed from an over-the-shoulder perspective because the original camera angles were intentionally designed to create tension and uncertainty, and I would agree. This, combined with the resource management, is why many fans consider the original game scarier than later entries. And this, of course, includes the remakes. Since the less control you have over the situation, the more frightening it becomes, since fear thrives on vulnerability. This brings me to my biggest problem with Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes, in terms of gameplay changes. Since the remake abandons the fixed camera angles and tank controls entirely, instead, it adopts an over-the-shoulder perspective similar to Resident Evil 4. The camera follows directly behind the player, and it can be freely rotated at almost any time. This gives the player significantly more awareness and control. Since with the over-the-shoulder camera, you can check corners before entering a room. You can quickly scan your surroundings. You can aim more precisely. You can react faster to threats. In short, you have far more information and control than you did in the original games. As a result, the type of horror changes. The original games creates fear through uncertainty and limitation. The remake creates tension through immersion and intense encounters. And while both approaches can be effective, they are fundamentally different experiences. An experience I personally find inferior to the originals. Alright, now on to the final reason I hate video game remakes, which is the mischaracterization of certain characters. And to drive this point home, I'm going to use Final Fantasy VII, which is currently one of the highest selling and highly praised role-playing games of all time. The reason I dislike the remake of this game is because of what I see, as the mischaracterization of certain characters. The biggest example for me is the legendary pilot Sid Highwind. Since in the original Final Fantasy VII, Sid is portrayed as an extremely rude, abrasive, and foul-mouthed individual. He constantly swears, insults people, loses his temper, and can be verbally abusive, especially towards his female assistant who lives with him, named Shara. He is impatient, aggressive, and rarely filters what he says. However, that rough exterior is only one part of his character. And to me, what made Sid interesting in the original game was the contrast between his personality and his actions. As I said before, Sid is a pilot whose dream is to go to space, to the point where it felt like an obsession. And after years of preparation, he finally feels prepared to launch. And despite acting like a complete jerk, at this particular moment, he ultimately gives up his lifelong dream of going to space and cancels the launch once he realizes Cher is in danger, since she was not in a not so safe spot while the launch was happening. Now, keep in mind that this is the same woman Sid spends much of the game criticizing and verbally attacking. However, this moment reveals the deeper side of his character. It shows that underneath all of the anger, frustration, and bitterness is someone who genuinely cares about people. That's what made Sid so compelling, since he wasn't a nice person, but he wasn't evil either. He was just rough around the edges. He was the type of person who might yell at you, call you an idiot, and complain constantly, but when things truly mattered, he would put himself on the line for others. And I've met plenty of people like that in real life, especially in manufacturing jobs and many other blue-collar industries. These types of people can be loud, blunt, and sometimes harsh with their words, but they also have a strong sense of loyalty and responsibility. Their actions often reveal more kindness than their words ever do. That's why Sid felt authentic to me. The problem is that the Sid we see in Final Fantasy VII Remake feels like a completely different character. Since in the original game, Sid is described as the most uncouth of the protagonists. He constantly swears, loses his temper, and chain smokes cigarettes. Heck, in the original, when Cloud and the rest of the party first meets him in Rocket Town in the original game, Sid is immediately abrasive. He snaps at people, speaks with hostility, and makes it clear he doesn't care about being polite. His dialogue is full of profanity and anger. His personality dominates every scene he's in. By contrast, this version of Sid seen in the Final Fantasy VII Remake is much calmer and friendlier. He is more polite and more welcoming, and far less confrontational when interacting with Cloud and the rest of the party. Instead of immediately coming across as an irritable, foul-mouthed mechanic with years of resentment built up inside him, he feels more like a laid-back pilot who occasionally gets annoyed than anything else. The difference in language, whether it be verbal or body language, is crazy. And again, he doesn't smoke, which is crazy to me too. Since in the original Final Fantasy VII, Sid is a chain smoker. His cigarettes are a part of his visual identity. He even keeps a cigarette pack attached to his goggles, but here it's nowhere to be seen, which is insane. Again, you can like this character. You're allowed to like whatever you like, but you're lying to yourself if you're saying this is the exact same character from the original. They're not. They're completely different characters. So yeah, man, that's why I personally tend to hate video game remakes, because I personally tend to find them inferior to the original in some shape or form, whether that's the art direction, gameplay, or mischaracterization of certain characters. And while I do think there are exceptions to the rule, such as the Resident Evil remake that came out on the GameCube, that was a remake of the original Resident Evil that came out on the PS1, that's just what it is. Exceptions. It's not the norm, unfortunately. So I'm at the point right now when whenever I see a remake of a classic game I love that's recently announced and I see footage of the game and I feel like the footage is inferior to the original in some shape or form, I am not buying it. Not anymore. Not happening. Because to me, in my mind at least, why would I waste my money buying something that I think is inferior to the original? It doesn't make any sense. And I'm directly telling the developers I want more of that, which I don't. So yeah, I also want to point out too that if you like any of the remakes that I was criticizing throughout this video, that's perfectly fine. That's okay. Art, like everything else, is completely subjective. So one man's trash is another man's treasure. Just for me, the games I mentioned were trash because I didn't like them for the reasons I stated. But yeah, my name is Austin Blue. The goal rather is to make gaming content once a week. I already have an idea of what my next gaming video is going to be. But if you enjoyed what you heard today, feel free to subscribe to my page. And yeah, looking forward to what's comes ahead. Thank you. Bye.